Well, I am delighted to be here. I am so sorry that I'm not going to be in person, that I'm not in person in Berlin, but I'm equally delighted to be here online with the rest of the audience. And I know, like I'm sure many of you, I'm actually really looking forward to looking back on everything that's already happened in Yokohama, everything that's happening today in Berlin, and what's going to be happening in the future in New York. So this is a very exciting time. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Clare Dillon. I've been part of the InnerSource Commons community for since about 2018. I was the inaugural executive director back in 2020, but I left a little while ago and I'm now pursuing a PhD in InnerSource. But I'm also a community lead at an open source community called Curious, which is working with university and research institution open source program offices. So they're all the hats that I wear. But for today, I'm here to give you a preview of some of the information that we gleaned from the State of InnerSource survey that we ran earlier this year. We do not yet have the full report to share with you, but we do have some of the initial data that you are going to get a preview of right now. So without further ado, I'll just pop into giving you a little bit of an overview about what we did and how it worked. So you all know, and you've heard earlier about InnerSource Commons, so I won't dwell on this. But in terms of the demographics of who gave us responses to this survey, we had about 115 responses, mostly from the InnerSource community. And I think that's important to kind of point out that in some respects, this data is biased by folks who are involved in InnerSource Commons. And the actual audience, as probably expected, is mostly male, quite experienced, vast majority had over 10 years experience, but there was a very wide spread in terms of the roles, from everyone from practitioners and developers to OSPO leads, VPs, program managers, and there was a wide diversity of roles within the folks that responded to the survey. Most of the folks came from tech, but it was actually spread across 9 sectors and indeed spread across all org sizes, but with the majority coming from large organizations. And all the responses came from the worldwide community. So we had responses from North and South America, Europe, and Asia as well. I do want to point out that we do allow, or at least we can't tell because the survey is anonymous, we may have multiple responses from individual companies, just to note that. So one of the things we wanted to do this year is actually dig a little bit deeper into what the concepts are or how people think about InnerSource. So we asked for the first time, what are the principles that people think are most important when it comes to InnerSource? And these were the responses. So top of the list came collaboration in terms of breaking down silos. Openness was a very important one, then transparency, the freedom to modify code, and meritocracy. So just to let folks know about how people are thinking about the relative importance of open source principles when it comes to InnerSource, this is how they are ranked. So I know Daniel mentioned it earlier, but we are hoping to dig a little bit deeper into this sort of insight over the next coming year so that we can share back with people how people are thinking about these InnerSource principles. And indeed, when we think about the practices that people are actually engaging in, these are the ones that came out as being the most important. So having clear contribution guidelines so that folks can contribute to your code, using open source tools and things like code repositories and things like that is a kind of also very important. Open governance, open source workflows, and indeed high quality documentation came out as some of the top responses in terms of which are the InnerSource practices that people felt were most important. When we think about what is, I suppose, happening in terms of InnerSource in organizations, here were some of the feedback that we got. When we asked folks as to what is the current level of InnerSource adoption in their organization, you can see here that it was weighted towards folks that are 20% emerging, but 40% was either growing or well established. And there were fewer in the folks that were exploring it or just piloting at the beginning. So what you can see here is perhaps indicative of the folks that are involved in InnerSource Commons being more represented in the survey, but you can see that there was a weighting or a spread, I should say, across all the folks at whatever part of their InnerSource journey they were on. And indeed, when we looked at when InnerSource was first adopted in their organization, it is indeed weighted towards folks that have been doing InnerSource for a little bit longer, but there was also a spread of folks who were just starting in that 1 to 3 years. In terms of the origins, and I just heard that question being asked of our keynote speaker a little bit earlier, in this survey, we had 43% report that the InnerSource initiative was started with a bottom-up initiative, 13% top-down, and 33% mixed, which I suppose goes to show that there is a significant amount of bottoms-up community involvement in the instigation of InnerSource within organizations, which is great to hear for community activity perspective. In terms of the trajectory of InnerSource in their organizations, we had reports that 32% of the respondents were scaling up, 34% were sustaining the amount of InnerSource, what they were doing and trying to improve that, and 14% were ramping down. Now, I will note that in looking at last year's data and this year's data, we were seeing a little bit more folks ramping down. We were seeing a little fewer folks scaling up, but we do see that there was quite a significant amount of, I suppose, attention and effort still going to InnerSource in companies. When we looked at the actual status of programs or initiatives, and it's a passion area of mine to look at the program offices and the ISPOs that are within organizations, we had 35% of the respondents say that they do have a formal InnerSource program office or an ISPO. And an additional 29%, nearly 30%, that had a virtual one. So something that was maybe a little bit more informal. So that's quite a high number if you see that we're over 60% of folks have some sort of initiative that is responsible for enabling InnerSource within their organization. And only 10% said they had no plans for an InnerSource program at all. So, it does look like this, I suppose, trend of helping InnerSource be more effective by fueling the enablement within an organization is an important one. When we think about the benefits that people reported as to how they were experiencing the benefits of InnerSource, we looked at it from two scenarios. One is from the organizational level. Why are organizations investing in enabling InnerSource? What's important for them? And then at the personal level. And this was an insight that came about a few years ago to realize that they may not be the same. So there are benefits that accrue to the organization. There are benefits that accrue to the individual. Sometimes they're same, but sometimes they're different. So when we think about the organization and the top organizational benefits that are reported or the motivations, one was code reuse, one was developer speed or efficiency, one was knowledge sharing, and one was culture. So this time, for the first time, we actually dug a little bit deeper into seeing how strongly people agreed with these various different statements of the motivations behind doing InnerSource in their organization. And you can see here that, as before, code reuse comes up top when it comes to the organizational motivation. If you then compare that with the personal benefits that individuals glean from actually practicing InnerSource, you can see that actually the social aspect, knowing more people, network building, those relationships that you're building across silos comes out top. And that was a common trend from last year. And indeed, sharing knowledge is an incredibly important factor for why people feel like it's a good thing to engage in InnerSource. And code reuse is in there too. So it's not that people don't want to be efficient, but I think it's incredibly important to recognize that part of the intrinsic motivation for people engaging in InnerSource is the social aspect. This idea that people are building networks, making connections across the organization, and sharing knowledge in an additional way, which is so important in today's fast-moving environment. Then we asked how people measuring their InnerSource activity. Which of those motivations did they see measurable progress against? And we can see that the top areas were culture, code reuse, and code quality, and indeed developer speed as well. So these were the areas, if you align them to the motivations that the organization had for engaging in InnerSource in the first place, these are the areas that they felt that they had measurable progress against. Now, then we asked, well, if you have measurable progress, how are you indeed measuring that? And it's important to note that the measurement practice is still, I would say, perhaps not necessarily embedded in every organization. So you're seeing that actually the vast majority of InnerSource measurement of progress is done in a manual way, usually by InnerSource champions or program leads, where they're reporting back on what they see as the activity. Sometimes that's done by surveys. or interviews with contributors where they're feeding back actual data. Sometimes, in a smaller amount of cases, it's done by tracking the use of an InnerSource portal or some of the tools they may have enabled, and some automated reports and dashboards. But that's, around about a quarter of respondents would say that. And this would track with previous surveys where we've seen a significant amount of informal tracking of InnerSource progress. I didn't get it in this time, but in last year's survey, we had someone respond that theirs was a gut feel in terms of how they felt that there was progress against something. But I think we are seeing a rise in the numbers of, I suppose, more formal measurement progress or measurement ways of measuring InnerSource progress. But there still is a ways to go before that's embedded in every organization's bag of tricks, I guess. So as I mentioned, top ways of measuring were manual tracking, surveys, and using the InnerSource portals or tools. Now, a key area that we've always liked to focus on is what are the blockers to InnerSource, because often ISPOs or InnerSource program offices or InnerSource program officers are always responsible for trying to remove the blockers so that at the very least, folks can actually actively participate in these InnerSource practices. And if we look at what the reported blockers are for InnerSource from the online survey, we can see that there are a number of common ones that are coming out. This year, again, we asked for a little bit more detail as to how strongly people agreed with these various different elements being blockers. Now, what's interesting here is that we've always seen the organizational culture and awareness of InnerSource as being some of the top blockers. But for the first time, a lack of resources and a lack of time has leapfrogged those blockers to being the top spot. So I think this may be indicative of the load that may be on individuals and indeed organizations when it comes to today's software development practices. And perhaps, and certainly this is coming through in some of the other survey results, the pressure that is on to deliver things more quickly, to get things to market faster, can sometimes, I suppose, influence the adoption of InnerSource, which does require a little bit of additional effort upfront in order to be able to enable great collaboration across the organization. So unless there is an intention and more intentional support of that collaboration, then the priorities and the urgent pressing priorities of an individual team may supersede to that, and that may actually reduce the likelihood of InnerSource success. And indeed, that may be at a team level or may even be at an organizational level where there is so much for all of us to consider and do in today's world, then perhaps the InnerSource activity may benefit from having more dedicated time or effort given to it. And that's one of the takeaways that I would certainly take from this, this new entry into the top spot of InnerSource blockers. Finally, we actually had a little bit of a look at the landscape that is surrounding InnerSource practices within the organization. And I think for the first look at this, we would looking at the actual types of projects that people are practicing InnerSource on. And what you can see here is that actually the top spots really are there where there is an intention to actually share the code. So if people are building libraries or internal tools that are intended for reuse, that are intended for wide adoption across the organization, that seems to be the most popular type of project that people are actually practicing InnerSource with. I always find it very interesting to see that documents as code is so high on this list. So this idea of collaborating on common documents is a commonly reported InnerSource project, and indeed platform projects are being quite high on there as well. I will also say that these grassroots community projects is quite high this year, up there with the platform projects. So what we're seeing is that when there is, I suppose, a specific reason why cross-silo collaboration makes sense, either you're doing it for that very reason, or the cross-silo collaboration will explicitly help the end goal of the project, that's where people are experiencing the most success with InnerSource. Next one is Gen AI, and I apologize in advance, but really these days, who gets to the end of the presentation without mentioning the term Gen AI. This year, we did ask the respondents as whether or not they're experiencing any interplay between Gen AI and InnerSource. And what we can see is that around about 30% of folks did respond. And I will say that from the data, you can see that within that cohort, most people were looking at multiple ways in which Gen AI and InnerSource work together. So that could be, for example, using InnerSource to share knowledge and prompts and toolkits across teams. So using InnerSource to help the adoption of Gen AI in a consistent, coherent way, which could potentially link to this benefit, the personal benefit. We heard about it, sharing knowledge and documentation as code. We've also seen a high instance of folks that are using InnerSource practices to develop AI tools, models. So not just the knowledge sharing, but also this idea of developing AI code. InnerSource is being used to do that. Thirdly, we are seeing how folks are considering how to integrate AI generated code into their workflows and projects. So how are they changing perhaps their InnerSource practices to enable, I suppose, actors that maybe AI actors collaborate with humans in terms of that development process? How does that work? And we're seeing that play out in the open source community as well as to how that may be actually managed. And indeed, how AI can be used to help InnerSource. So what are the automations that are being put in place so that Gen AI can actually help with the InnerSource adoption within organizations? So we're seeing some organizations exploring these various different areas. Many are exploring more than one. And it is definitely an area that we will watch closely and hopefully learn a little bit more about in the coming year. So I suppose that's my little snapshot of the results. We are working on the full report, but you've got here a preview of what the results are showing, and I hope you find them interesting. Before I go any further, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who is involved in this actual survey, because it was a collaborative effort in itself in terms of designing the survey and the responses. And indeed, thank you to the University of Galway, my host university, for providing the platform for running the survey. I will also say that if you're interested a little bit more in this work, please join us in the research channel on the Slack. We would love to see you there, whether you're interested in doing research, whether you're interested in being a subject of research, we would love to see you there. Or if you just want to hang out and hear the latest news, that would be good too. And I want to say thank you, and also to invite anyone who is interested in this work to please do connect with me. I would love that.